Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our History Seminar 2020. This year is a very different seminar. Obviously, I don't need to tell people the reason for that. So this year we are streaming our seminar on Facebook Live, so we'll be welcoming all our listeners on Facebook. We'll also record the seminar this year, and hopefully we'll get that out to people. So, firstly, I'd like to maybe thank a couple of people involved in getting this event up and running. My name is Patsy Wells. I'm chairman of the Knocklong History Group. I might be chairman, but for the history event this year, I've done very, very little because we've kind of broke up into different groups. We have three things going currently. We have the restoration of the Station Master's house in Knocklong, which is at an advanced stage, so we have planning permission almost on the point to grant it, and obviously from there we go into the building phase. So a 1.2 million project, it's a hell of a big project, and we have a great team of people working on it. On the secondary issue then, we have a very hard working team, Rosemary Flanagan, Mary Harty and Dave Kelly, who've been working very hard on two things. One, developing the book, which is it's a compilation of all our history boards over the last number of years. It comes to a total of a 160-page booklet. It's going to be a must-have for people, and we will be publishing that book in the next couple of months. And it's an absolute fact-finder's mission of everybody. A massive thank you to Tom Toomey and his wide team, who have researched all the members of the different brigades coming them on, the flying columns. So that's something we're going to have out quite soon, and we'll be publicising that a little more later on. In relation to the seminar today, I'd have to say back in May, when things were quite busy and other things, I was one of the people who said, I think we'll let the seminar go this year because we have too much other things going on, and with COVID and the whole lot. And I think Rosemary Flanagan was the most vocal in saying, no, we have to do it. We have a commitment to do it, and we get it done. So for those of you who will see the camera shots and will hear the sounds, but you won't see what the hall is like today, maybe a third or less of the hall is taken up by Tom Welsh and his crew, Dara and Alan Flynn, who are here from the company Hear It, and they're responsible for broadcasting this and doing the sound and doing the audio-visual work. So a massive thank you to you guys for coming here today and helping to get this out to people. That's the first part of it, which is the hard part, a very hard part. In terms of organising and planning, Rosemary, Dave and Mary have done 99% of the work, to be honest, and I can't say enough of thank yous to them. And Rosemary made her radio debut today, promoting. Actually, it wasn't, because I think you were on News Talk there last year. So she's going nationwide in the next while. So next year I won't be standing at this podium. I'll be handing that over. But again, I want to thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank Jim Dooley and Pat Doyle, who are great workers with us every time we have an event. They're here. They're always here working with us. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, Dairy Gold, Mitchelstown Credit Union, Tigeen Honey for giving us the Wi-Fi today, Hensh's, Dooley's and the Kerry Group. Without them, we wouldn't have these events. We wouldn't be able to carry on and do the things we need to do. Obviously, one person missing today who's synonymous with these events, who we found in the last week or two, suddenly we didn't have mobile numbers for these key people who are going to speak today, because Tom Toomey takes care of it all. Unfortunately, Tom is not able to be with us today, and we wish him well. He's down for a little bit, but he's not down for long, and he'll be back with us again quite soon, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Another man who's been with us for years and who moved on last year from the history group, Joe Maloney, and Joe has been a fantastic worker for us. He's been a great help to us, especially when it came to technical stuff, IT stuff. He was fantastic. I must say Dave Kelly has taken over a lot of that, and he's doing a fantastic job. I'd like to thank Joe for his work. I'd like to wish him and Jerry and Stephanie and Tom well, and we'll stick with them, and we hope to hear from again in the future. I won't hold you much longer now. I want to, number one, thank our speakers. So Dr. Tim Horgan will be our first speaker today, and he'll be followed by Tomas who's happily stood in at short notice for Porigog O'Rourke, who hasn't been able to fulfill the engagement. And then, last but by no means least, we'll have the one and only John Connors. And I'm really thrilled to have John back also. So I suppose when it comes to Tim Horgan, I was thinking about this morning. I'm going to say something that a parent shouldn't say about their favourite child or something, but I had to hop off of Tom Toomey a few times. I said, I want Tim Horgan speaking the next time he's here. And Tom said, okay, we'll see about it. We'll have a chat about it. And fair dues to Tom. He came back and he fulfilled that, so I'm really looking forward to hearing Tom. That said, the last time Tomas was here, he brought the house down with a great rising speech. And John Connors, I needn't say, is much loved in these parts, and his history of the life of Sean Horgan is very much thought of. Just want to say also, I know there's two friends of mine below and do and listen to this, Tom O'Sullivan and Philly Fitz, and Tom is closer to 80 than 70, but he's gone very IT friendly in the last couple of years, and I know Liam Sullivan, his son, was saying he was going to put him on book face so he could listen to this. And I said, you want to go on top take, Tom, because, you know, he's getting very modernized. So Tom, I hope you listen, I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have questions, and if you have, send them in. We'll have a question and answer session towards the finish of this, but we'll let lecturers do their pieces, and we hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Dr. Tim Horgan, who's going to talk mainly on the flying columns in Kerry, but talk about the flying columns in general. I suppose what I didn't say at the start is the subject of this year's seminar is about the flying columns and their impact. So thank you for that, and I call on Dr. Tim Horgan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it was indeed a great privilege to be invited to speak here again. And I'd like to pay tribute to the Knocklong Committee. They have done Trojan work in keeping all this history alive, history that's kind of disappearing from our schools somewhat, but as long as people like those in Knocklong are still there, Ireland's past will not be forgotten, nor will its heroes and those that which they've fought for. So Knocklong remembers 2020. So I'll be dealing with the flying columns from a Kerry's perspective. We're quite humble in Kerry, unlike our neighbours to the east, and we were just a little bit slow in coming into things, and so we had to learn lessons. These lessons probably were fairly obvious to people in Limerick and maybe Tipperary, where the flying column was an early fighting unit, but in other parts of the country the flying columns never really got off the ground. So this is from the Kerry perspective only. So we'll go back to the very start. In 1916, the Odd, full of arms, 20,000 rifles, machine guns, came into Tralee Bay, and the idea was that these would be the arms to fight the 1916 Rising. And in Tralee that day, there gathered about 250 men and women, and they were to be joined by others from East Kerry. So altogether about 300 people armed with these German weapons were due to march through Abbeyfield up Newcastle West and to join up with the volunteers in Limerick. So you would have had 300 armed men with weapons they'd never seen before heading towards Limerick. And so in retrospect, it was a good thing that maybe that this all didn't come to pass, because one or two British machine gunners would have laid them all low in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes. They had good practice at mass killing when it came to Arabs or people from Africa or the Chinese. The machine gun was a way of dispensing unarmed or poorly armed opposition very quickly by the British Army. So maybe the events of 1916, if they had occurred, we probably would have not had a very successful ending. So we learned lessons from this. The first lesson to be learned was big numbers don't matter. The enemy will always have more. There would always be more British soldiers. they would always be more of their colonial police. So no matter how many Irish nationalists or Irish Republicans there would be, the British could always supply more. So numbers didn't really matter. The second lesson we learned, you really have to be as well armed as your enemy. In other words, there was no use going out to fight them with shotguns that were designed for shooting foxes. You really had to get as good weapons as the standard British Army had. In other words, Lee Enfield rifles, which were the standard military weapon at the time. The third thing was that we had to use the countryside to our advantage. There was no use marching through open countryside where you could be cut down very easily, just as the rebels in 1798 tried vainly to free Ireland by pitched battles and all that. So the countryside, the mountains and the valleys and the bogs, they were our allies, and they were the enemy, really, of our enemies. And the third thing was, don't trust the Germans, and really indeed anybody you don't know. The Germans let us down, the outsiders always did, so really we had to go and get our own weapons, and we had to do the job ourselves. And from 1916, this is what we learned. But the flame of freedom wasn't quenched in 1916, and the 13th of April 1918, way before Solohead Beg, this group, 7 Kerry volunteers, attacked an RIC barracks in Gorticlay. Unfortunately, 2 of them were killed. Their aim was to get the policeman's weapon, and afterwards the 5 men had to go on the run. So these were men that had to go on the run. They couldn't go home. They were being constantly watched and harassed. So these were a group of poorly armed volunteers with really nowhere to go. One of the forgotten things in Irish history is the land wars, or what we would call in Kerry the Moonlighters. These were local bands of men, generally, who went out at night really to right the wrongs imposed by landlordism and by their supporters in the RIC. They essentially were set up in 1879 in Castle Island in mid-Kerry, and were involved in a guerrilla warfare with what were probably called the security forces of the day. And bit by bit, they took control over the countryside, and really the land question was solved, maybe not so much by Michael Davitt, but by the Moonlighters. And it was the sons and probably the grandsons of these Moonlighters who would be the backbone of rebellion in Kerry from then onwards. So Captain Moonlight, kind of that mythical figure, what did we learn from him? Well, we knew who to trust and who to avoid. So men on the run knew what households would keep them, what households wouldn't. They knew where they would not be betrayed, and they knew where they could find recruits. So from the landlords, we also found that even those who were not with us would not betray us. So all people who mightn't have great nationalist leanings or Republican leanings, if they were from your own area, that loyalty to one's place would often prevent betrayal. And the third thing we found, that the Moonlighters were eventually successful in achieving their aims, as the land was eventually returned to the people. So guerrilla warfare by small groups of men, maybe not well armed, out in the middle of the night, did achieve a victory, and that gave the rural populations a confidence that the British Empire, for all its might and all its bribery and all its coercion, could yet be defeated. So taking up arms against Britain, even in the shadow of the defeat of 1916, was not a madcap idea. This is the Castle Island district in mid-Kerry. The neighbouring townlands, Ballymakelliget, Cordle, Scartyglen, Corrow, maybe Fireys, these ended up being the centre of the start of Republican activity in Kerry in the post-1916 period. In 1918-1919, the County of Kerry was divided into 3 brigades. The North Kerry area was the Dingle Peninsula, Tralee Town, North Kerry and a little bit of South Kerry, and Kerry No. 2 Brigade was East Kerry and South Kerry, and the Kerry No. 3 Brigade was down in the corner, too far from anybody else to care. It had a very small population, and there was just one town there, Carsaveen, which really wasn't a great centre of population, but it did have a Republican tradition from the Fenians of 1867. Things in Tralee and in County Kerry were a little bit slow to start with. Maybe that's just a Kerry cuteness, seeing how everybody else got on before they stepped in themselves. But in October, the end of October 1920, Tomas McCurtain died on hunger strike, Terence McSweeney died on hunger strike, and then shortly afterwards Kevin Barry was hanged. And an order went out from the General Headquarters that the British forces, police or military, were to be engaged, and there was, wherever they were seen. Throughout most of the country, this order was ignored, but in Kerry they took it to heart, and 2 policemen were killed in Tralee, and there were many others killed in small villages around North Kerry. The result then was a clampdown in Tralee. There were many, the police appeared on the streets, and those Republicans in the town had to get worried for their well-being. Now, quite foolishly, you'd wonder what they were doing. They had a photograph taken of themselves a year previously. So Major McKinnon and his auxiliaries and that, and the local RIC had no problem identifying men that they needed to arrest. So what did they do? Well, they left town. And when they left town, they went to a place called Fibuck. It's the small townland on the south side of the Slieve-Mish Mountains. Slieve-Mish Mountains form the backbone of the Dingle Peninsula. And where they went was on the far side of the mountain, so far away from Tralee, and in a peninsula. So this was an ideal spot if you didn't want to do any fighting, because you were so far away from your targets, but it was safe and not such a good idea, and probably reflected badly on the leadership of the men that headed off. So they headed for the hills. The leader of the Kerry No. 1 Brigade at the time was a man called Paddy Cahill. Cahill had no military experience. He was a popular local man, but apart from his popularity, nothing else really going for him. So he took the men on the run, maybe about 80 of them, to a place in the mountains. The actual headquarters is still there, a group of stone buildings, maybe about a mile up the mountain from the main roads, and really they just hibernated there. Cahill wasn't very aggressive when it came to military activity. The dugout is still there. Unfortunately, it's not marked as a national monument, which of course it should be. At the time, they covered it with wooden planks and then put sods over that. So when the British Air Force were patrolling over the mountains, they never picked up on this. And that headquarters was occupied until June 1921. So Cahill was down in Fibuck, so the guys in North Kerry were itching for a fight. The difficulty was they had no contact with their brigade leaders, so they set up their own flying column in the north of the county. These were really made up of men who had Republican sympathies that were known to the police, or men who couldn't return home for various reasons. So they set up a column based around the Listowel area. There was about 30 in this, and this was really too big. So then after a while it split into 2 smaller columns that were more manageable. They attacked British forces in the various villages around North Kerry, but really these were low level of attacks. So all changed in January 1921, when this man from Tipperary, Andy Cooney from near Nina, a medical student in Dublin, was sent down as an organiser to the South Kerry area. And the first place he went to was the Castle Island district. Men on the run had congregated in the area around that, in the bogs and mountains to the east of Castle Island. They were downhearted. They had a few weapons, but not many. And they had really a lack of leadership. The leaders that were there since 1913, and they were old and stale and not very aggressive. Cooney came down, and the first thing he did was to meet these men. They told him he was wasting his time, but Cooney set about setting up what they call a flying column, or an active service unit. So he took the best of the men and brought them to the Gap of Dunloe. The Gap of Dunloe is in the McGillicuddy Reeks. It's obviously there's no population living there. It's about 3 miles long, and there would be no surprise attack because you could post sentries at either end. The place they used was this building here, abandoned and derelict now, but at the time it was abandoned too. It had been an RIC barracks during the land wars. So they took over this and used it as their headquarters. They moved in their typewriters. And what they did was they got this man here on the right to his head circle, a man called Jim Coffey. Coffey was from a Republican family. He had fought in the Great War with the British and returned full of enthusiasm for the freedom of his own country and full of knowledge and how to use weapons and all that. So for nearly 2 to 3 weeks, Cooney kept his men in the Gap of Dunlow, training them and repeating drills, firing practice and all that. The only rule that was there was that they were not allowed to go to the edge of the opening of the Gap of Dunlow where Kate Kearney's cottage was. There was a pub there, and men on their own might get thirsty, so that was the one rule they had. During the middle of that training session, which lasted about 3 weeks, the better known fighters were left to go to a place called the Bower, which is halfway between Killarney and Rathmore. Rathmore is on the Cork-Kerry border, and they waited there for 2 days for a British Army patrol that was bringing troops from Killarney to Buttervent. After 2 days, they found, well, nothing's happening here. Somebody's bound to open their mouth. So they moved farther along the road to a place called Clunban and Cross, which is maybe halfway then between Rathmore and Mallow. And there was a big ambush, and men of the Kerry column joined up with men from the North Cork column, led by Sean Moylan. There was many British soldiers killed, including Hanway Cumming. He was the most senior officer of the British Army, killed, I think, in action, certainly during the conflict. They headed back. The Kerry men headed back to the Gap of Dunlow, and on St. Patrick's Day they were fighting fit. Out they came, went to Farm 4, hoping to attack a British Army or police column in that area. The attack didn't come off, so they headed eastwards over towards the mountains on East Kerry when they heard there was a British Army troop train coming from Conmara to Killarney. So they laid in wait at Headford Junction. Headford Junction was one of the few small stations that didn't have an RIC barracks. We won't go into the details of the ambush that was there, but it was fairly intense. 8 British soldiers were killed at least, but the column's commandant, the head man, Dan Allman, and another volunteer, Jim Bailey, were killed, and 3 civilians were killed in the crossfire. During the attack, another troop train, by sheer bad luck, was coming from Mallow with machine guns, so the column were lucky to escape back into the mountains of East Kerry, back into Mangerton Mountain. They crossed back then and sought sanctuary in the mountains. The day before that, the Kerry No. 1 column, who spent most of the winter in the mountains, were goaded into ambushing a British Army convoy that was to travel between Dingle and Tralee. They waited for 3 days, no sign of the British, but on the 3rd day the British arrived, stopped a mile from the ambush site, divided into 2 large columns, and the British then were outflanking the ambushers. The ambushers just managed to escape before the circle closed. 3 IRA brigade, or Kerry No. 1 brigade volunteers were killed. The column was lucky to escape, while technically it was a defeat. In fact, it was the last big incident in the West Kerry Peninsula, as the British then retreated to their only post at the time, which was in Dingle. So I suppose overall it was a draw. So these 2 big incidents, both using brigade columns, the Kerry No. 1 brigade column at Lispole, the Kerry No. 2 brigade column at Headford, had near disastrous results. So who comes to town but Liam Lynch? Lynch had recently been appointed the commander of the 1st Southern Division, a man of great respect, and he came to Kerry to a place called Castlemaine. And there he met with his brigade commanders at the house of Dan Mulvihill. Mulvihill was a senior Republican. And an inquiry was held. and they found that the brigades were becoming a problem. The evenings were getting longer, and so there was a greater danger of capture. All the fighting men were congregated in one big brigade, so capture or defeat of the brigade columns would have disastrous consequences. The columns were too large to maintain. These columns were maybe contained 20, 30 men, big strong men, all hungry, all tramping the countryside. So trying to feed those was difficult. As any mother knows, if there are young men in the house, keeping the fridge full is definitely difficult. In these days, there were no fridges, so the women of the area spent their time baking bread and milking cows just to keep these men, keeping them fed, really. So large columns produced an undue burden on the population they were living in. And it's never a good idea for a guerrilla army to do this to the population on whose benefits they were living on. The other thing was, when the numbers were very large, personality differences and splits were becoming apparent, and this certainly was not a good idea. So what they did is they disbanded the two large columns that were in Kerry, the two brigade columns, and they sent the men back to their own battalions. So this would be back to maybe, 8 battalions in North Kerry and 6 battalions in South Kerry. And each man had been battle hardened at this stage, and those 2 or 3 men from each battalion formed in turn a smaller battalion column. These were now well armed, as bit by bit Lee Enfield rifles became more available, generally because they were captured at ambushes throughout the county. The battalion columns were also given the option of operating independently throughout the county, and for larger events they would team up with neighbouring battalion columns or with local companies. This was probably all just as well, because in the spring of 1921, as the weather got better, the British Army flooded the county, as they did in West Cork, with troops. Troops would be brought in, often by sea, to form a big roundup. They would select an area of maybe 100 square miles and encircle it and close the circle, hoping to catch any columns that were there. So in Ballyhige, in Rathmore, in the Killarney area, in the mountains in Killarney area, in Dingle and Conmara, you had these what were termed large roundups. And there was no way a brigade column of 30 or 40 men would be able to escape intact out through the encircling troops. So these smaller smaller battalion columns, made up of between 8, 10, 12 men, had no problem slipping through the gaps that would appear in mountainous territory as the encircling rings closed. Kerry No. 3 Brigade was kind of forgotten about. A small area, little British presence. The men were poorly armed, but as the war went on, 2 columns developed, one in the northern area and the other along the northern coast of the Conmara River. These battalions really only became active at the very end of the Black and Tan War, but they would be the most effective columns during the Civil War. So little columns sprung up throughout Kerry. Just some photographs. This is the 6th Battalion column in North Kerry, near Listowel. This is the Kerry No. 1 Brigade, 2nd Battalion column. This would be in the Kilflynn area. Several of these men were killed in Ballyseedy later. And this is Kilcummin, Kerry No. 2 Brigade area, another photograph of these men. These photographs would have been taken during the truce period rather than during the Black and Tan War, when things got a little bit easier. But you can see they're all well armed. In Kerry, the battalion column remained the mainstay of the Republican Army, and in familiar terrain they proved an effective fighting force despite overwhelming enemy manpower and weaponry. So throughout the Civil War, this was the basic unit rather than big brigade units. And the last of them, really, the last, this was Aero Lyons' column, Kerry No. 2 Brigade, and they were tracked down just in the last few days of the Civil War to that cave, Clashmilk and Caves. There were 11 men in that column. 3 of them went to a dance the night the brigade was, while their comrades stayed in Clashmailkin Caves. The 3 went to a dance, not social distancing, and when they did, they were the 3 survivors. All the others were either drowned trying to escape, killed at the site, and the survivors were executed. So flying columns, a bit like the COVID virus, we found it was better to avoid large gatherings. Smaller groupings were okay, so that were the battalion columns. To wear masks if necessary, but when you were around people that you knew, your local population, you didn't really need a mask. I suppose if you went into town, it'd be different. Open air activities, especially shooting in the countryside, was permissible. And these didn't travel outside their own county, so just like the restrictions today, staying within your own county is better. And really, you're better off not having too much to do with Dublin. There was maybe, just as today, this is an area of danger with viruses around, but operations directed from Dublin certainly didn't pull much punch with local operations, really. So, like all our wars, like everything that works best in Ireland, it works best in Ireland from the bottom up, whether it's the GA or Cole Tory or St. Vincent de Paul. It's local organisation, local volunteers that do most in Ireland, and so it was during the Black and Tan War, where the battalion columns, the flying columns, were those that gave us as much freedom as we have in Ireland at the moment. Gormila Magwib.
Only Tim Horgan could put a link between the coronavirus and the flying columns. Fantastic. Great presentation, and will provoke a bit of discussion later on. Very interested to see one thing there. For the last few years, a lot of the presentations were showing the shortage of weapons in every situation, and suddenly by this period we're suddenly able to match weapons with weapons to a certain degree. So that was an interesting feature. I have to take you to task on one small issue. I work with a lot of Kerry people, and by God, they are not slow in coming forward. So you might say a lot of things about the Cork boys, but Kerry fellas are bashful. They definitely are not. So thank you, Tim, for that. Very interesting. And if anyone has questions for that there, they can keep them together and we'll pull them in later on. So our next speaker is Tomas Conmara, Clare man. He's currently finishing off his book on the Scariff Martyrs, and due to be published shortly, but now will be published in the spring of 2021. So again, a must-have. And today, Tomas will be talking about, his lecture is called Tempered Steel, the development of the East Clare IRA. So without further ado, I'd call on Tomas to come to the podium. Just before that, I'd just say one or two people were having problems with Facebook, but I think the problems are on their side, not our side. So we are streaming perfectly, I'm told. So Tomas will be coming to the podium very shortly here. The battery of IT technology here is impressive today. So again, our thanks to Tomas Walsh. Our audience consists of 2, 4, 6, 8 people. So Morgan Murphy and Mrs. Walsh from Knocklong are the extras outside of our own group today. So unfortunately, it hasn't been too open to the public. So Tomas, your go.
Gorbila Mahagud Patrick, agus Gur Mahagud Valig. Just while Tom is setting that up, I'll just make the point that, as Patrick mentioned there, I was called in because Padraig O'Rourke wasn't available, so I'll do the best I can. I haven't had the greatest amount of time to pull something together, but I did welcome the opportunity to talk about the evolution of the East Clare IRA and the role played by flying columns in that broader experience. And I suppose what I want to kind of do in my presentation is, of course, document the way in which the IRA evolved in East Clare, the principal actions they were involved in and the significance of those, both locally and nationally, but also to kind of reflect on the experience that that period was for the broader community. And I've always felt it's absolutely critical for us, if we're to try and narrate the past, we have to try and narrate the experience of that past, because sometimes we can get into, listing actions and numbers of people killed, numbers of people involved, etc. But for every action, there's an experience, there's a background, there's a legacy, and all of that human experience, we have to be able to try and document and share. And certainly in my work as an oral historian, principally, I've been very fortunate to be able to speak to people who were able to carry in their words and their memory and their emotion that experience. So when you consider flying columns active in Kerry or in Clare or Limerick, the experience that went with all that activity is reflected sometimes in the memory that we've inherited and the tradition we've inherited about that period. So just to illustrate the value of oral history, very briefly, I want to bring up this slide. It's a letter that was written in late 1920 from Chicago. So almost 100 years ago now, this letter was written from Chicago by a West Clare immigrant and sent back home. And in the letter at the top, you mightn't be able to read it, but it reflects on the burning of Cork in December the 11th, 1920, and how the news came through in Chicago and the impact it had emotionally on the people. And in the same letter, you will see a reference to a little baby. And it says that I'm enclosing a little present for the baby. She mustn't be a baby now, she must be nearly going to school. That's the little girl, which you can faintly see in the image, who was 4-year-old Catherine Maroney. And I had the great fortune, over 90 years later, to spend over 10 years in her company as often as I could to document her memory. She passed away in 2016 at the age of 101, and she was able, even from that child's recollection, to give me a greater sense of that experience than in often cases historical records were able to do. So that's the case right across, as I say, the country, right across the whole experience of this. And why that memory endured so strongly is actually very well reflected by Rudolph Fielding, of all people, who was the 9th Earl of Denbigh, as you can see there. And he wrote a letter in late 1920, which was quoted in the House of Commons, and it says as follows: "What hope is there of peace in Ireland when the whole of Ireland is in this condition, and every child goes to bed at night in terror, hearing shots and seeing murders? These ineffaceable and indelible memories will make them enemies of our country for the whole of their lives." So he predicted the endurance of the impact that the British methods of confronting the IRA in Ireland would have, and certainly we know from the last 100 years that rang true in many cases. In the context of County Clare, a significant point, although I think Tim was completely right to reflect back on the Moonlighters and on the Land War, because all of that forms an emotional foundation and a consciousness that is reflected and is manifest often in the way the War of Independence takes place in different parts of the country. You can't disconnect people from what they inherit in terms of feelings and emotion and anger, which fuels later activity. But in 1917, County Clare took a very strong role in the national movement, particularly after the election of Eamon de Valera, when a 3-phase policy was implemented by leaders of the Clare Volunteers. The first was to march in front of the police in direct contravention of the Defence of the Realms Act. They knew they'd be arrested. The second phase of the policy was to refuse to recognise the court, and the third phase was to demand political prisoner status, and when that was inevitably denied, to go on hunger strike. The consequence of that was the middle of September 1917, 38 prisoners were in Mountjoy jail. Among them, 16 were Claremen, the biggest representation of any county, but also among them was Tomas from Lisbole and Kerry. And 5 days into the hunger strike, on the 25th of September, he died as a result of very brutal force feeding. And it is my view, and many might disagree, but I think that's the moment, that's the pivot in modern Irish history, when Irish political consciousness turned almost entirely from one of underground support partially for the idea of separatism to almost full support to the concept. Not 1916, but a year and a half later, when the Irish people are far more aware of the idea of Irish separatism, and now somebody dies on hunger strike, and dies in a very brutal way on hunger strike. That moment and the emotional impact of it, I think, is one of the most significant moments in modern Irish history. So Clare then, from that experience of having men directly involved in a leadership role in a national moment, took on a reputation and an experience which is really critical. In 1918, they were brought to various by-elections, particularly down in Waterford, where the son of John Redmond was up for election, and the Republican movement in Waterford invited Clare volunteers to come down to help with what was going to be a very violent election campaign. That flag you see in front of you has blood on it from a man called Louis Horgan from near Cratloe, who was shot during that election campaign. He didn't die, but he was shot, and they had to wrap him in the flag, quite literally, and the blood is still on it. Clare's Untamed is an interesting description that they put on themselves, I suppose, when they were going down to Waterford. So certainly you're seeing Clare and in East Clare the foundation of a leadership grouping that would be really significant as the War of Independence evolved throughout that period. The experience is really important, and you know, we talk about the flying columns today, but you can't separate really the flying columns from, you know, the earlier versions of the IRA. It's the same people, it's a natural evolution, it's a natural escalation, but the experience is really critical, because I've always felt, you know, the IRA couldn't survive without at least significant support from the general public. And the experience of the general public was critical in that. So if I can get Tom maybe to play Michael O'Gorman's piece, you'll get a sense from, you know, the general community of how the impact and the treatment of the general public by the British Crown Forces would impact in the support for the IRA and for the flying columns.
Beat up my grandfather and my granduncle Michael. Michael was his brother-in-law.
That's Michael Young, is
Michael
it?
Young, yeah. They were coming in from Knocklong, having been fishing, and of course, like a lot of the lads at the time that did extensive fishing, they were fishing illegally with a creel, they called it. And when they were coming home, they were coming up the Fecal Road, they're near McMahon's. The Tens were actually on their way down the Fecal Road. So, of course, nothing at home to stop the two lads and searched. Now, they had a commander, a Captain Rigby, or a monumental ass if ever there was one. When they searched the haversack that the lads had, they discovered the creel, and they decided anyway, like, that the two boys needed punishing for this. So they struck my grandfather into the face with a butt of a rifle and smashed his jaw. And I hammered him and kicked him while he was on the ground. But Michael tried to help him, and I struck Michael with the butt of a rifle, and when Michael fell, one of them stood, you know, his arm went out like that, you know, and one of them stood on him. It stood on his arm, and another stood on his back. And they got the butt of the rifle and they smashed his arm again and again and again with the butt of the rifle. And when I was a little lad, I used to spend a lot of my time with my granduncle. I used to notice his arm, even when he hadn't his sleeves turned up, which was like a sickle, like that. The doctors were never able to get his arm straightened out. They were able to save it all right, like, you know, but they could never get it straight. So that his arm was bent over like a sickle.
So that's Michael O'Gorman from Scariff in East Clare, and as you say, as I said, you can, you know, judge from that type of experience at the time the amount of anger that would fuel. He mentions his grandfather, who was one of the men beaten that day. His grandfather had been in the British Army himself, you know, and would have been, you know, previously in relatively good terms. But the environment changed so dramatically that became, you know, a relatively typical experience of of people. Neither of those two men were in the IRA at all, but yet were subjected to a beating like that. And that plays out, not for everybody, it does play out though, in the levels of support and the levels that people are willing to go through. Tim quite rightly mentions the impact of flying columns in mountainous areas and the pressure that put on people and on safe houses. But they were willing to endure, certainly a lot more than they might have typically because of the way British forces had treated the general population, particularly after the arrival of the Black and Tans in March 1920. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to actually move past this one, Tom, so we're good for audio now. But just to kind of talk chronologically, briefly, about the way that the period escalated in East Clare. The 18th of September, which was just 100 years ago last week, really, was really the point where things started to heat up in East Clare. The East Clare Brigade, or certainly a number of battalions from within the East Clare Brigade, started to move towards Scariff under the direction of Micheál Brennan from Meelick, who of course was the most significant IRA figure in the East Clare area during that whole period and was OC of the East Clare Brigade after he took over from his brother Patrick. But the decision was taken to attack the very heavily fortified barracks in Scariff, because it was the final remaining heavily fortified barracks in the North East Clare area. All smaller barracks had been cleared out up until that point by the repeated attacks of the IRA in the area. So it was a very significant operation. There were men like Tomas Malone or Tomas O'Muelone, or as he was known as Sean Ford, who was part of the Limerick IRA, came to Scariff. So did Nicholas the Wire, another Limerick IRA man, came to support Micheál Brennan and the East Clare IRA in the attack. Bombs had been brought down from Dublin in the days beforehand. Unfortunately, didn't work. Again, going back to Tim's point about not having much to do with Dublin, it was a real problem. The firing pins weren't long enough, it seems, to detonate. But in either case, the attack took place. And, it was significant in terms of its ambition. 2 RIC men were shot and not killed. The barracks defended, and you'd have to say fairly bravely defended itself during that attack, and the IRA withdrew 2 hours later. The barracks was abandoned in the days that followed and was, as you can see here, this photo is taken from the 50s, but it was destroyed as soon as the British forces left the barracks, and therefore, subsequent to that, in the whole of North East Clare, from the Galway border as far as Killaloe and over as far as Tulla, had no regular British force or police presence, and that had a double-edged effect. It gave the IRA a sense of freedom within that area, but it also attracted far more aggressive and widespread raids from places like Tulla, where the Oxford and Buxham Regiment were based, and also then from Killaloe, where the auxiliaries who arrived subsequently into the area were based as well. Within the period of the 18th of September 1920 and 2 months later in November, you had a number of very significant attacks, which I'm not going to go into in great detail, but suffice it to say that the first RIC man killed in East Clare was in Broadford, when Constable Michael Brogan was shot dead by a unit of IRA who had over 20 members in it. So this is part of the kind of evolution between an active service unit or a grouping of IRA men who are available and prepared to take action, and what would become a flying column in many cases. 2 more were killed in O'Brien's Bridge on the 29th of September. Constables Downey and O'Keefe were killed in a public house by Micheál Brennan and other members of an active service unit of the IRA. On the 7th of October 1920, 2 RIC men are killed in Fecal. This is all over a couple of weeks. Are killed in Fecal when an ambush took place outside the graveyard of Fecal. That has significance that I'll come back to just very shortly. But an informer or an alleged informer is killed by the Fecal IRA at the end of October. And then on the 16th of November 1920, the Scariff Martyrs, as they became known, were murdered on the bridge of Killaloe. Now that was a significant incident in the sense that on the attack, during the attack on the Scariff Barracks, 3 of those men were involved. Martin Gildea, who was on the far left, Alfie Rogers next to him, and the man on the far right, Michael Brud McMahon. And it was after that they had to go on the run. And ironically, the flying column didn't evolve really, as we would know it, until 1921 in East Clare. But there had been a direction down from Dublin, and I think it was the 4th of October, the number 1 organisation memo came down to tell the IRA in outlying areas that a flying column should be established, wherein IRA men had been forced on the run. What they felt would be best in that scenario was to form a flying column of invariably trained and active men. The fact that they're on the run generally meant that they had been active and involved in actions. So to morph that into a flying column was suggested, but it came too late for the Scariff martyrs, who were betrayed by an informer, captured, very brutally tortured, and as I said, murdered on the bridge of Killaloo. Many of the people I spoke to, like Margaret Hoey at the age of 105, Paddy Leeson at the age of 106, had very emotional and detailed memories of that. At the end of the year, obviously, Clare was one of the counties which was put under martial law. So you enter 1921 in a situation where there had been in East Clare a number of significant attacks. 10 people had been killed from the 18th of September to the end of the year, when none had been killed before that. So there's clearly an escalation of the conflict. There is now more men on the run, and what we now would describe as flying columns emerge, or a flying column, it should be said, emerge. Joe Noonan on the right-hand side there from Tumgraney was one of the men involved in Cratloe on the 13th of January 1921, when, again, what we would certainly characterise as a flying column, led by Micheál Brennan, organised an ambush on Crown forces moving between Ennis and Limerick. And again, a very significant action, because it's a reaction to the implementation of martial law. You would think martial law's intention was to quell the Republican movement. The response on the 13th of January was that ambush where 2 people, Sergeant Curtin and Sergeant Carty, were killed in that ambush. There was an immediate reaction from the British forces in Limerick, who arrived out into the Cratloe district and began arresting and beating people immediately. They, funnily enough, and there's humour often breaks through in these scenarios, but they went into a house where they knew the ambush party had been waiting, and they found a half-eaten goose, and they had their bloodhound, and off they went looking for the men when the bloodhound got his scent, until at some point the bloodhound turned into a farmyard and started chasing geese, because that was the scent that he had managed to pick up. But in any case, it is important to mention that after that ambush, there was a severe reaction on the people. There weren't reprisals, but there was a severe reaction. 40 people who weren't involved in the ambush were arrested. The flying column, as it had become, went to the area of Oatfield near 6 Mile Bridge and dispersed. Came back together a week later on the 20th of January and lay in ambush in a place called Glenwood between Broadford and 6 Mile Bridge. And therein launched a very significant ambush which resulted in the deaths of 6 members of the Crown forces travelling between 6 Mile Bridge and Broadford, including District Inspector William Clark, 3 Black and Tans and 2 RIC men. That led to the burning of 21 houses in the Kilkishen and Broadford areas, and very significant destruction and terror for the people in that area. The flying column again went to the Oatfield district and dispersed once more, and came back together later in February and prepared several ambushes and didn't take place. And we have to remember, there can be the turn of a road in the difference between the preparation of an attack and something that we commemorate for 100 years. And there were far more prepared attacks than there were actually attacks that went off, and there could have been multiple reasons why that didn't take place. But the flying column was certainly together infrequently from January through to April, until the 4th of April, when they arrived into the Mount Shannon district, and Tom McNamara, one of the senior IRA men in that area, remembered at least 32 IRA men arriving into the Mount Shannon district. And I've spoken to several people who would have provided safe houses for them, who would have supported them. 2 pigs would be eaten in a couple of days, when, as anyone from a rural background would know, a pig would last a long time for a rural family at that time. But certainly the support was there. The evidence is there that the support was in place, and people were prepared to, insofar as they could, help with mobilising and supporting and sustaining flying columns in these cases. There was a significant attempt in a place called Bohatch during this time, whereby the British forces from Killaloo and from Tulla arrived into the area in their hundreds when it had been established that the Flying Column were in the area. But what was really critical in that point, and a point that needs to be made about the effectiveness of Flying Columns generally, was that the IRA, through the help of local Republicans, local scouts, were able to manoeuvre their way and navigate their way throughout the East Clare landscape in a way that clearly the British forces were not. And that is so critical to guerrilla warfare, it's critical to the Flying Columns, it's critical to the whole insurgency, that local people, operating in a local place, trying to liberate the nation, were far more effective than the British ever understood. Because in an area where the terrain would be difficult, not to mind being able to navigate the geography, the IRA had that advantage. And that was probably one of the most critical factors, as well as the support, as anything. So I'll move on fairly quickly just to get through towards the end of it. These are some of the individuals involved. But I do want to mention this. I won't read through it all. But after the attack in Cratloe that I mentioned, Sean O'Halloran from outside Scariff was badly wounded. And when you look through the records of that period, and even testimony from former IRA men, there's very little reference to the role of women during that time. So you had a Flying Column man injured, got support from local people, and managed to recover over the following couple of months. But what's forgotten or not mentioned is the fact that Nan Horgan, this woman you see here, was absolutely critical to that. She's from a Republican family, but she immediately comes in the aftermath of a Flying Column action and pretends that the man who was wounded is her brother, who's drunk, gets by a British patrol, and subsequently organises a hearse and gets him into Limerick on the basis that he's dead, and gets him to a friendly RIC constable's house, and manages, subsequent to that, to get him to Kathleen McCormack from Conmara, the lady on your left, who takes over from Nan Horgan and continues to support Sean O'Halloran in his recovery. Kathleen McCormack, again, as I say, from Conmara, had been involved in bringing guns in and out from Limerick to East Clare to support the Flying Column, using the military pass that I managed to get my hands on from her daughter. This is Kathleen. She never spoke about it. I interviewed her daughter in 2010, and her daughter knew about her father's activity in the Flying Column. She knew nothing of her mother's activity apart from she was in Conmara and she got a medal, but had only been involved, as far as she understood, in canvassing for Eamon de Valera. It turned out, from a collection that I subsequently got my hands on, that woman, Kathleen, her mother, had been involved at the highest levels of the East Clare Conmara Brigade, and without them, the Flying Column in East Clare couldn't have survived. So we reconnected her daughter, Mary Galvin, with the story of her mother when Mary was in her 90s. And again, there are always these hidden dimensions. Two more ambushes to finish up with. I've mentioned the Glenwood ambush, Micheál Brennan's role in it. What was really critical here is this man, Joe Clancy. Joe Clancy was a former British soldier. Micheál Brennan gets a lot of credit, and rightly so, in terms of the War of Independence. But Joe Clancy, who was his training officer, was really critical both in Cratloe and also in Glenwood in terms of the strategic positioning of the different sections of the IRA in those ambush sites, and he's often forgotten. He was one of those real characters who used to boast about having both an IRA pension and a British Army pension when he was living in Killaloe. And there's many stories, too many to get into now, about Joe Clancy. Tom McGrath, who was an All-Ireland hurling winner with Clare in 1914, our first All-Ireland, was a key member again of all of those actions. The impact in terms of the burning of houses I've mentioned, which was a constant impact and consequence of Flying Column actions that the people, certainly weren't happy, but it is evident were prepared to endure. The final action I want to mention is a peculiar one. When the Flying Column, which again had established a reputation, had established experience, were invited by the West Clare Brigade to come over to help them in an attack in Kilrush on the Marines, on the RIC, and on the British forces based in the town. And it's a very significant and a very unusual decision, but it was soon enough after that attempted roundup in Bohatch, when the Flying Column managed to evade hundreds of British forces, that they decided to go to West Clare. They went down to Renana, 60 members of the what we'll call the East Clare Flying Column, and made their way from Rhinana, current day Shannon Airport, on boat to Kildysart, and from there made their way over land to Kilrush. And were involved in, as I say, attacking the British forces there. The grave we're looking at there is, Sean Maroney and Pat Houlihan, two significant figures who were involved in that action in West Clare. The Mid-Clare Brigade were right next door to the West Clare Brigade. You would have thought they'd have gone to them. But what's important to remember in Clare, I'm not sure how many of you would be aware of it, but the Mid-Clare Brigade and East Clare Brigade were led by the Barretts and the Brennans respectively, and they hated each other. So Dick Mulcahy at one point wrote that if the Mid and East Clare Brigade spent as much time fighting the enemy as they did themselves, we'd have won the war at this stage. So I think the West Clare Brigade in coming over to East Clare and asking for help was an insult, I suppose, to the Mid Clare Brigade in some ways. But to finish off briefly, they went to West Clare, and one of the most ironic consequences of all of this is, I mentioned the fecal ambush a little earlier, and 2 RIC men being killed. A third was wounded that day, but not badly. And he went around that evening with the Black and Tans, leading them to burn several houses around Fecal. His name was John McFadden, a Derryman. And one of the women I spoke to, May Toohey, who you'll see there, remembered old women coming into her house when she was 4 years of age, kneeling around in a circle with their shawls, as she recalled, praying that their homes wouldn't be burned. But all their homes were burned, and McFadden was seen as certainly responsible for that. One of the other people I spoke to was Michael Howard from Kilrush. So you have, in October 1920, May Toohey remembering the aftermath of the Fecal ambush. Subsequent to that, John McFadden was sent back to West Clare because the attention on him was fairly severe after the Fecal episode. When the East Clare Brigade made their way into West Clare, one of the houses they stayed in was the house of that man you see, Michael Howard. And here's a photo of him as a young boy. So he saw the East Clare Brigade arrive into West Clare. They left the house. He remembered his mother and his aunts spraying them with holy water before they left. They went through Kilrush Wood, into Kilrush Town, and were involved, as I said, in several actions against the British forces. Ironically, one of the men that they encountered and shot dead that night was none other than Sergeant John McFadden. So 6 months after the Fecal ambush, 6 months after he had led the Black and Tans around Fecal, burning houses, he was encountered on the street of Kilrush and shot dead by the East Clare flying column, who he had gone to Kilrush to get away from. But again, it shows the effectiveness that they were able to get across the county from East Clare over to West Clare and back unscathed. Was again, I think, a really strong example. Before I finish up on the final quote, just a few things very briefly to repeat. In understanding the nature of the flying column, some of the, I think, assertions made by some historians and commentators in recent years are challenged. There have been many attempts to suggest that the IRA were pulling violence on the people of Ireland that wasn't wanted, that the support wasn't there for them. It's quite evident to me that it was. And the IRA in an active service unit, in a company, in a battalion, or in a flying column could never have been effective without at least significant support from the general public. So if a flying column is effective in East Limerick, if a flying column is effective in East Clare, you have to base that on the support being present and being active in those local areas. Micheál Brennan in 1936 was the Chief of Staff of the Irish Army at that point, but he was given a ceremonial sword by former members of the East Clare Brigade and the East Clare Flying Column, and he said as follows after receiving that through the mist of years, I see you again in the East Clare Flying Column. I see you facing bitter winter nights in 1920, cold, wet, shelterless, hungry, hunted. I see your loyalty to one another, your trust in one another, and the love of the people for you. You had to learn how to suffer, endure, and fight. You never flinched. You went through the fire and emerged as tempered steel. So I think that's a really, I suppose, strong statement from a former comrade of those men You know, for some people that won't ring true, but I think in many cases it does, and it did. And, you know, without the flying columns, you wouldn't have independence. Without the support to the flying columns, you wouldn't have independence. So I think if we can try and, as historians and as people, pull together all that story from the safe house up to Dáil Éireann, you know, we'll have a better understanding of this really critical period in our past. So I leave it at that. Go raibh míle maith agaibh.
Thank you, Tomas. Fantastic considering the short notice you had. What a detailed explanation of the flying columns in County Clare. I often smile when I hear these lectures. In our early years, Tom Toomey would lead us to believe, and I hope you're listening, Tom, that Limerick was the heart and soul of every rising in Ireland. And when I hear the Kerry men talking and the Clare men talking, and even Dr. Pat McCarthy from Waterford always puts up a good fight for the Waterford men also. It's interesting. So there's a couple of good points there and a couple of interesting ones about that possible pivot point, and we might talk about that later on and see. And also the support. I often wonder, you know, you had people who had economic reasons for not getting involved, and you had people who had belief reasons, and I suppose you could put it the same today in a lot of cases. Now we go to a Tipperary man, one of my own. John Connors is very highly thought of here, obviously with his history on Sean Horgan, A Troubled Life. I was at the launch, which is 2 years ago now, John, or two years ago. Jeez, time flies when you're having fun. And it was a fantastic night, and obviously you had met with his son, Sean, also, and had done absolutely in-depth research on that, and it was fantastic. He's going to talk today on the flying columns in Tipperary, in North Tip mainly, but he obviously is going to tip a little bit on West Tip and even a bit of East Limerick. So, Tom, if you're listening, I'm sure you'll be wondering and questioning every detail he'll mention about the East Limerick area. So I call on John Connors now to give our final lecture.
Thanks, Patsy. I think it might be maybe 5 or 6 years ago since I spoke here first. And I came down on a very special night here. It was a Friday night of your seminar. And the plan was that I would maybe fill maybe 20 minutes or half an hour before Patsy unveiled the plans and the diagrams and the progress report on the restoration of the station house. But I adopted what you would probably describe as a Conor McGregor attitude. I didn't come to take part, I came to take over. And after an hour and a quarter, I could see Patsy was getting impatient, so I decided to get down. But all was forgiven, and I'm a regular visitor back in Knocklong, and a welcome visitor, thank God, back in Knocklong since then. So Patsy, when I go over the 20 minutes, and when the needle is going into red, you just fire the warning shot. So I'm here to talk about, I was asked to talk about the flying columns of North Tipperary. In any aspect of the War of Independence, it's very hard to talk about anything in isolation because there's so much interconnection. And so what I do is I talk a little bit about the flying columns of North Tipperary, a little bit about, I won't say South Tipperary, I say more West Tipperary. And with Tom Toomey's blessing, I hope to trespass a little bit into East Limerick. I have huge admiration for East Limerick, I have. And I gained that from my research into the events around Sean Horgan, who I wrote about. So, in this lecture, I suppose the flying columns are just one aspect of the War of Independence, and I approach history, the decimation of history, this way. In the life of a person or an incident, to broaden that out, and you can tell a wider story. So that's what I hope to do, to tell a story. To distinguish the reality from the myths, you know, what's happened. And, you know, just briefly to talk about the myths, you know, the song says, I joined the flying column in 1916. Whoever it was, he couldn't have done that, he couldn't, because the flying columns weren't formed until October, November 1920. Unless, of course, he was to, you know, the only previous reference I can find to flying columns go back to the Irish Constabulary in the wake of the Fenian Rebellion. The flying columns of the Constabulary, they rounded up Fenian rebels. Of course, a lot of my research went into the life of Sean Horgan. A lot of the knowledge I've accumulated and the material I've accumulated have derived from that. I want to refer a little bit about the killing of a man called George Sheehan in silver mines, and I'll come to that in my next slide. Intelligence and counterintelligence. You know, played a huge part in all of this. The impact of reprisals can never be underestimated in two senses. In the winning of the war of propaganda, and also in I suppose, you know, reprisals could have had two effects. It could have alienated the population from the IRA, but in actual fact it did the opposite. And a number of unanswered questions around certain incidents, and I suppose an overall appraisal too of you know, how all of this concluded. And I suppose I can thank my grandfather maybe for my interest in history. And a young child, you know, I remember one time I got on the crossbar of his bike as a very young boy, and he took me down to the commemoration in Solihead Bake. And he had all these songs he had, you know, and one of them was, at Solihead the war began, and soon was heard the song. It told of Horgan's rescue at the station of Knocklong. And the next verse then went on to, soon after hunt the bully fell. And that song gave, I suppose, a chronology of the War of Independence as it happened in West and Mid-Tipperary. So, you know, it's probably accepted now that you know, that the War of Independence did begin at Solihead Beg. You know, that can be disputed too again. An incident happened at Solihead Beg where 2 policemen were killed, and so much violence and bloodshed and mayhem evolved from there that something significant happened. You know, but you want to call it the beginning of the War of Independence or not is, I suppose, immaterial. But down to the rescue of Horgan after Knocklong. The killing of Sergeant of Inspector Michael Hunt in Torres, District Inspector Michael Hunt in Torres, that was a direct consequence of Horgan's rescue in Knocklong. So was the killing of Sergeant Brady in Laura. Dan Breen and Horgan and Tracy on their way back to, and Robinson on their way back to Dublin, after their sojourn in Conmara and Clare and under the hospitality of Michael Brennan, and indeed previous to that only Hickeys and Knocknagoshel, they crossed the Shannon at Port Humna and they stayed in Laura, and soon after their stay in Laura, Sergeant Brady was killed. And Breen impressed on the people, Dan Breen impressed on the people, that he, you know, places where he stayed on that journey, the need for local units to initiate action against Crown forces, and that's how what happened in Laura happened. On the 20th of January, Constable Luke Finnegan was killed at the steps of his house in Thurles. Constable John Heaney on the 4th of March was shot in Fannon's public house in the Rag. Now, in a way, maybe that can be traced back to what happened at Solihead Beg. But I contend that he has more of a connection with what I referred to in my opening remarks there is about the killing of George Sheehan in silver mines. Henry Sheehan was home at Forlock from the First World War on Christmas of 1917, and he brought his rifle with him. And the local IRA, the O'Brien brothers, John and Paddy O'Brien, and a couple of more. They raided. Sheehan was gone down to the pub with his friends to have a drink, and when he was gone, the IRA raided the house to take his rifle. In the melee that followed, his father, George Sheehan, was killed. The O'Briens were arrested, they were put on trial. They stood trial 3 times, and finally they could gain no conviction. But Pat O'Brien was dismissed from his job as a school teacher, and he took up employment as an agent for New Ireland Insurance Company. But what he was really going around on his bicycle selling insurance policies, he was also an organiser for the IRA. And he went into Fannon's pub in Bullet off near Thurles. And the reason he went in there was to meet a man called Jim Stapleton, because the two of them had something in common. The two of them had been involved in fatal incidents. Stapleton was the man who assassinated Hunt in Thurles, coming back from the race meeting. So the two of them met there, I suppose, as a fellowship or kinship or whatever. And probably, you know, being in a public house, they certainly weren't right. Around 2 constables came in. Young Henio went up to the counter, he looked for 20 eggs. And Larry Fannin, behind the counter, he was wrapping the eggs in newspaper individually. And the IRA men called on the constables to surrender their weapons. The constables refused. Henio jumped over the counter, and a shot was discharged, and he was killed. Constable Healy and Rocky and Conmara were killed after. That was really a get-even incident. A Sergeant Begley, a notorious sergeant in Conmara, he brought in a local volunteer called Paddy Harty, and he beat him severely. And when it was the day before Patrick's Day in 1920, and Rock and Healy were coming out of the chapel after devotions, and they were shot by the local IRA. They thought it was Healy thought it was Begley was the man there. Finn and McCarthy in Lackamore on the 9th of April 1920. That would be a direct result, a direct derivative of the killing of young Henio in the Rag. It would not be as associated as such with Solihull Beg. Now, the escalation of conflict. So, up to April of 1920, and this is in all of Ireland, a third of the police killed were from the North Tipperary area. The administration of justice was effectively broken down. The O'Brien trials that I referred to, they were aborted. No jury were convicted. Also, something else significant was happening. And this was the tenor of the inquest juries, the tenor of the verdicts they returned. And some of these, you know, we say, like Tomas McCurtain in Cork, the inquest into Sergeant Peter Wallace and Constable Michael Enright in Knocklong, the killing of James McCarthy in Thurles, Tom O'Dwyer. These were very damning verdicts against the Crown Forces, against the authorities. And 2 MPs who taken their seats in the House of Commons, Jeremiah McVeigh from Donegal and Daly from County Down, they would get up at the House of Commons and they would ask the Under Secretary McPherson to give an account of these things. And McPherson, much to his embarrassment, was often forced to read out verbatim what these inquest juries returned. So it was a huge embarrassment, so much so that I think around August of 1920, coroner's inquests were replaced by courts of military inquiry. March, of course, December of 1919 saw the recruitment of the Black and Tans in London, followed by recruitment offices opened up in various different places. March of 1920 saw them coming to Ireland, taking up their positions, fortifying RIC garrisons that were already there. October 1920 brought the auxiliaries, and December of 1920, martial law declared in 4 counties in Munster. Diarrhea structures in Tipperary. Tipperary had 3 brigades. Number 1, North Tipperary, you could say loosely based around Nina. Number 2, the Thurles area, Mid-Tipperary. And number 3, the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, I suppose probably the best known, certainly, celebrated in song, story and writing, the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And I contend more West Tipperary than South Tipperary in general. Towards IRA flying columns, small groups of IRA men on the run, barrack attacks, maybe what you describe as recreational violence. On Friday night was a barrack to be attacked, and groups of young men would get together, and these people began known to the police. Young men having to go on their own, they've been wanted, being arrested. Diarrhea were also, trying to move the conflict some way beyond individual assassinations of policemen. From October 1920, the flying columns were formed by the brigades in Munster, and the survival of the brigades, this was going to be a problem straight away, it was. And, I have there about, men taken for their beds and shot. And, they say local enough to hear, I suppose, in Aherlow, you can recall the killing of the Wire brothers. The 3rd Tipperary Brigade was formed towards the end of October of 1920, and to be associated as Dinny Lacey's column. They had huge initial success. At Thomastown on the 28th of October, they ambushed a lorry of British military coming from Richmond Barracks in Templemore to the rifle range in Ballyglass outside Tipperary town. And 3 members of the Northamptonshire Regiment were killed in that. Just as a matter of interest, the names of those was Lance Corporal Frederick Short, a private Hobbs, I can't recall his first name, and thirdly was a private Thomas Crummy. And I began to take an interest in these fellas, and I kind of always took it for granted that Crummy was a Cockney, that was stationed in Templemore. In the 1911 census, he appears in the workhouse in Nina, along with his mother and his 2 sisters. From the workhouse in Nina, born to an unmarried mother. Well, at least on that day anyway, he fulfilled the role of the enemy, he did. Listen, go on the 13th of November. November of 1920, to me, the bloodiest month of the War of Independence. 4 RIC, there was actually 2 regular RIC and 2 black and tans killed in that. So Dinny Lacey's flying column, the number 1 flying column of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, had huge initial success. But after that then, it petered out, and a lot of ambushes were mounted, but none of them ever came to fruition. The formation of columns, who served in these? The various battalions were approached to supply suitable men, and a brigade would, a flying column would consist of 20, 25 people, armed with whatever arms were available, generally poorly armed, Lee Enfield rifles, shotguns, revolvers. Now, Ned O'Leary was the initial OC of the North Tipperary the flying column of the North Tipperary number 1 Brigade. He was later replaced by Jack Collison. Colonel Jerry Ryan, he was later Colonel in the Free State Army. he was the man in charge of he was the OC of the flying column of the Mid-Tipperary Brigade. And Denny Lacey, he was OC of the number 1 flying column of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And later on, Sean Horgan was appointed to a second flying column, to lead a second flying column. And, this is a pretty onerous position to be given, especially for young men, perhaps with little enough military experience. And, plenty of hardship and all that goes with it, as well as, I suppose, taking the fight to the enemy. Much of their time was spent evading arrest and, being hunted by their enemy. The Sharkey photographs of Horgan's flying column, and I don't know that I don't think it was that Horgan's flying column was that photogenic, but not that many photographs of flying columns have survived. But one of their members, Jack Sharkey from Clonmel, his people owned a camera shop, and he took a number of quite a number of photographs. And for those, I have a man called Neil Sharkey, Jack Sharkey's son, to thank for those. Amongst those photographs is, there's an iconic wedding photograph of Dan Breen's wedding. Would be one of those. The column's security was provided by local battalion. The local companies supplied the security, responsible for the billeting of them, for their security, for the feeding of them. Generally, it was a pretty dangerous business, really. The danger of spies and informers was constant, and a number of people, especially in West Tipperary, I just think there of Kerry over there from Anacarty, being one, were taken out and some early executed on the suspicion of supplying information to the authorities. The number 1 brigade, they trained on the hills above Donegal, a place called Crimlin-Beg. They came into Nina, they attempted an ambush on the creamery in Nina on the 2nd of November. 2 days later, Lieutenant Hamilton, on his way back from Templemore, he was ambushed at Casey's Cross and shot dead. There was an unsuccessful attempt at an ambush at Latra between Neen and Borrisley, where I come from. It wasn't so much that it was unsuccessful, only that Pat Doherty, the man in charge of the Templederry company, he was approached by Sergeant John Igo, the local RSC sergeant, who informed him that he knew that there were men planning an ambush, and it wouldn't be in their best interest to go ahead with it because there'd be a danger of well-armed military being on those patrols. So Doherty took his advice and didn't go ahead with it. And the same Sergeant Igo was, by not ever supplying intelligence to the volunteers, he was certainly sympathetic to them, he was. On the 16th of December 1920, they moved from the Nina area, from the lower-lying land around Nina, to an area adjacent to Newport, Rare Cross, that area, in the mountainy country. And on on the 10th of December of 1920, they got word that the RIC from the barracks in Conmara regularly went to the post office in the village to collect their mail. And they did that because the local mail car was being robbed on a regular basis. But on the way, they were ambushed. And Ned O'Leary was the man in charge of that, the leader of the flying column. Now, there was 4 black and tans, 4 English-born black and tans killed in that. And when the IRA withdrew to a little townsland called Glastrigan in the parish of Templederry. And while O'Leary was debriefing his men, who enters the house only Pat Doherty, the OC of the captain of the local company, and he berated O'Leary for holding the ambush. And why did he do that? He said to O'Leary, he said, if you're that fond of ambushes, why don't you have a few around Nina where you come from yourself? Which shows, everybody wanted action, but few enough leaders wanted action on their doorstep, where to bring reprisals to their doorstep. That the local creamery would be burned out and, local homesteads burned down and people intimidated. So people wanted action, but they wanted it someplace else. Jerry Ryan was leader of the flying column associated with the Mid-Tipperary Brigade. Now, he was, later on in the Civil War, Jerry Ryan, Colonel Jerry, he proved himself an able general. He was a good man to handle situations, a good man around a cool man under pressure. And he was involved in the killing in January of 1920 of Constable Lou Finnegan in Tomas. He was involved in a successful taking of Littleton RIC barracks. So he was a man who was respected, and he knew no fear. On the 26th of January 1921, at Pinestown between Urlingford and Killinall, they mounted an ambush. They ambushed a lorry of British military, and they seriously wounded a number of those, and 2 of those, Sergeant Martin Brackenbury and Private Henry Stave, those were killed. They were actually lucky enough to escape. Because that road was patrolled regularly by military lorries, and very soon, after that incident, there was a garrison station in a place called Ballinunty, and them and the passing patrol were soon on the scene. So Colonel Jerry Ryan was lucky enough to escape with his life and with his men out of that one. He was. Jerry Ryan was arrested 2 days after. He wasn't arrested for that. He was arrested for the incident of the taking of Littleton Barracks. He was lodged in Spike Island, and he was transferred into Kilkenny Jail, where he escaped in November of 21. Number 1 Brigade, Ned O'Leary was replaced as OC after what I would describe as the Devaney incident. A number of men under the command of O'Leary, they gathered at a pub in Cloughjordan, and they were actually planning a site for an ambush. And perhaps having stayed a bit too long in the pub, word was reached to them that there was a military patrol on the way, and the men scattered. And as they scattered, they were fired on by the military patrol, and Devaney fell. Now, he wasn't killed outright, and he wasn't really seriously injured, but he died from loss of blood. And when Sean Gaynor, the OC of the 1st Tipperary Brigade, when he began to investigate this, he felt that Devaney's comrades left him there where his life could have been saved. And because of that, O'Leary was dismissed from that post. He was. And his place was taken by Jack Collison and Money Gowell. They moved around, generally in the mountainous areas, looking for to plan ambushes and places where they could attack Crown forces. But none of this happened until the 3rd of June of 1921. Now, a group, Borrisokane Barracks was attacked on the 1st of July of 1920, and the courthouse was also damaged. So the Pesci sessions that would have been scheduled to take place in the town of Borrisokane were transferred to Cloughjordan, and regularly groups of RIC men on bicycles, they cycled from Borrisokane to Cloughjordan to prosecute summonses at the Pesci sessions of Cloughjordan. And this became well known. And on the 3rd of June of 1921, a cycle patrol of 12 men, they left Borrisokane for Cloughjordan. Sean Gaynor took command of this particular action. Jack Hollis stood down from his role as OC to let Gaynor take charge. The ambush took place, a short encounter, and four RSC men were killed. One of those was James Briggs. He was from Scotland. He was the only black and tan that was killed. There were other black and tans on that patrol. John Cantillan from Carlow, William Maher from Kilkenny, and also a man called Martin Feeney from Roscommon. Now, Feeney escaped the initial gunfire, and he took refuge in Houlihan's, a neighbouring house. But he was taken up by diarrhea and he was shot on the roadside. It was actually Martin Feeney who supplied the intelligence to the local IRA that that the patrol would be passing at that particular day. But whatever, in the confusion, whatever, it certainly didn't save his life, it didn't. Now, what's very interesting about that is that from the IRA point of view, subsequently with the availability of records, we find very little mention of Martin Feeney and how he came to his death. And what we do know is my colleague that should be here instead of me today, Sean Horgan, daughter of the Black and Tans in North Tipperary, he interviewed William Cossett, a Northern Presbyterian, who was actually a member of that patrol, and he gave a very detailed account to Sean Horgan as to what happened to Martin Feeney. Coming to a stand down, the truce on the 11th of July, the truce could have not come any more conveniently or quicker, I suppose, for the IRA. Here in this immediate hinterland here, on the 1st and 2nd of March, on the 1st and 2nd of May of 1921, 8 IRA men were killed, 4 at Shrahala, 4 at Lakelly, just out the road. On May Day, 2 IRA men, Sean Duffy and Paddy Maloney, were killed at Gortdrum. 10 losses within space of 24 hours. So, in terms of military engagement, at that particular time, Crown forces were beginning to gain the upper hand. 220 deaths in Tipperary. Only a small number of those can be associated with the active service units, with the flying columns. We can count them. We can 4 in Kilcommon, 4 in Modrene, 3 at Thomastown, and 4 in Lisnagowl. So the overall assessment of the flying columns, and I suppose the myth of the War of Independence, this has, I suppose, maybe, through song, story, through embellishment, exaggeration, or whatever, those maybe not familiar with the study of history might think that it was the flying columns that brought England to the negotiating table, And I would certainly contest that viewpoint. They were only in place, from late October until March. The individual assassinations certainly played a huge part in bringing the conflict to a conclusion. The retaliations, the reprisals. In this sense, a man called Hugh Martin of the Manchester Guardian, he came to Ireland, and he was perhaps what you describe nowadays as an embedded reporter. And he reported accurately and factually on what he saw happening in Ireland. And when the story of the burnings of homesteads and farms and creameries reached the British public, especially the creameries, they were not too happy about this, because the cooperative movement was an English thing, and they took a very dim view of this. And the English public had become war-weary. They had just emerged from the First World War with the loss of countless lives and families decimated. And reports of coffins being disembarked on a ship, a fish guard in Liverpool, did not sit well with the British public. Of course, for drawing the conflict to a conclusion, we can never forget King George's remarks at the opening of the Parliament in Northern Ireland. Played a big part in it. Many attempts, but only a handful of ambushes were successful. The brigades, I suppose, the cumbersome chain of communication. Local companies reported to brigade headquarters, and their report generally consisted of very minutely activity nil, So occasionally, when these reports were being written up in dispatches, British military patrol or RAC patrol passing here for last 3 Thursdays, and the flying column will come, be billeted for the night, and all that went with that. Only to maybe discover from the locals that no patrol was seen for the last 6 months. So again, people did not want the reprisals on their doorstep. So there was certainly quite an amount of false intelligence. The danger of poorly armed units. For instance, the men in Kelly, poorly armed, against a detachment of the Green Hours, fully armed. Like, you're really talking about no contest. So, like, that these men did, that they did procure results in so many incidents, there's great credit due to their courage and their bravery. That element of surprise, again, like Kelly Shrahala, so much of this. The survival of active service units was a major achievement in itself. For instance, in Cork, a complete unit at Clonmult wiped out. Those who weren't killed outright were summarily executed. The high level of support. What I recommend that people do to really gauge that is so many pension applications, IRA pension applications for common and non-members have become available in later years, and these graphically describe the details and the sacrifices that ordinary people made in support of the war effort, in support of the flying columns. And something that I want to mention in conclusion is the forgotten flying columns. And in this, I want to pay particular tribute to the flying column of East Limerick under Donegal Hannigan. Tom Barry's column of West Cork is well remembered, celebrating Song and Story with on the 28th day of November, the Tans left the town of Macroom. And at Drumkean, the Crown Force experienced 11 fatal casualties, second only to that of Tom Barry's in Cork. Yet O'Hannigan's achievements are, never found their way into the popular lore, like they should have had. And it's not only Drumkean that O'Hannigan and his men were involved in, but many other incidents as well. Perhaps one of the most, perhaps along with Barry's, one of the few flying columns that did carry a tremendous fight to the enemy. And I suppose the reason for that is something maybe for another discussion, but however.
Thanks, John. Never short to detail is John, anyway, and most of it doesn't have to be looked at for notes. I don't know what kind of a pastime you have, but you must read every journal and book and account that was ever seen, and I suppose your good friend Eddie assists in that, does he? For sure. Okay, listen, without further ado, we'll go. I must apologise again for our heating system. I think this is my 6th year in a row apologising about our heating system. When we turn on the heat, we won't hear the people. When we turn off the heat, we freeze. But so we won't keep us too long tonight on our questions and answer session. But at the same time, we always like to have a little bit of questions and answers. So we'll hand over now to Mary Harty and Dave Kelly are going to coordinate some of the questions. Thank you very much.
So what was it about the Kerry mentality that made them hold out longer than any other part of the country during the Civil War?
We had great belief in our cause, probably, and great belief. I suppose the other thing was that the county was really united. The columns really didn't split on Civil War politics. The only area where you had a significant defection to the Free State was in North Kerry, and a lot of that was personality driven. The people in North Kerry got few arms from the Kerry No. 1 Brigade commander, so they had a personal gripe against him. But for the rest of the county, all the battalion columns all held together. So even after the Civil War, they still kind of remained united.
Okay, and that was from Connolly's in our Patrick, asked that question. So the next one is, the East Limerick Brigade organised first flying columns in Ireland. Is this widely accepted in other countries? Counties.
Well, certainly we'd make no claim to it anyway. And I'm sure if he's from East Limerick, he's telling the truth, so that's fine.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I certainly wouldn't contest that the East Limerick Flying Column was very well established and well structured and recognised very early on. But I suppose the kind of definition of the definition of a flying column is sort of loose. And I think, where you had anywhere between 10 and 20 men, in late 1920 who were involved in actions that took them on the run and across different areas, they can arguably be called a flying column. I think East Limerick was just that bit more structured and recognised before that. But in other areas, you had just the natural evolution of IRA actions, active service units, the necessity to go on the run, and the logical evolution of that to become a flying column for a period of time. And in lots of cases, the flying column would be active and then would disperse. So there's very few cases where a flying column continued to operate for more than a month before it would disperse and come together again.
I think there, my closing remarks, I mentioned with Donegal Hannigan, and the man, he never got the recognition that he was deserving of. Now, personally, I have, as a Tipperary man hopping over the border here, I have huge time for the men of East Limerick, going back to the early days of the conflict. They overcame the difference between O'Hannigan and Lee Manahan. And Sean Horgan would never have been rescued from the train at Knocklong had it not been for the men from Galbally. Their effort can never be underestimated. I have huge respect for the men of Galbally and East Limerick as well, what they've done to avoid conflict come the Civil War, and what they've done subsequently to mend defences. Now, I'm going to say this about O'Hannigan. There's a reason why everything happens. Denny Lacey celebrated in all the songs, and you know, the romanticism has followed him. As far as I'm concerned, O'Hannigan was an astute leader. He procured results. He was a great leader of men. Now, O'Hannigan joined the National Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Himself and Liam Lynch were actually from Anglesborough. They were what we would call neighbours, and they did broker peace in Limerick. There would have been no battle for Limerick if O'Hannigan and Liam Lynch had to be left to their own devices, which proves to me that the two of them were gentlemen of the utmost decency. Now, any place O'Hannigan went during the Civil War, no executions followed him. Again, to his eternal credit. And because of that, he was seen as soft by the authorities. He never gained any promotion as such in the army. That's just O'Hannigan. I could say similar about Liam Hayes, similarly about Danny Grace and Gary Douglas, who actually took the Republican side. So many top players who contributed so much came from that area of East Limerick. But I just say this. If Tom Toomey's book, The War of Independence in Limerick, if it done nothing else, only to give the names of those men the proper stature and the recognition that they deserve, it was one great service.
So, lads, I think you addressed this in some of your lectures there. Did the flying columns lead to the truce between the British and the Irish Republican Army? So there was some opposing views.
Yeah, I suppose the flying columns were mainly a Munster phenomenon, really, and certainly they were just gearing up for action in Kerry and in Cork and in Limerick by the time the truce was called. People in Dublin seemed to think that the IRA was on its last legs, but they never asked Liam Lynch, and there's no records of them making any communications with the 1st Southern Division. On the night before the truce, there was a massive attack in Castle Island, another massive attack in Kilorglin, and in Temple Glanton at Barnet. There was columns that came from North Cork, North Kerry and Limerick to attack a British Army patrol. So really we were just gearing up when people with vested interest asked us to stop. And the problem was that we were left within an Ireland that was divided for the next 100 years. So maybe the full-time whistle blew too quickly.
I might just add a little bit to that, Mary. I think, you know, the flying columns, you know, and the more structured nature of IRA actions as the war progressed did inflict more significant damage to the British forces. But it's not a case, I don't think, that the British forces were well capable of absorbing the numbers that were being killed. But it forced their hand in the sense of the tactic they adopted of reprisals, you know, couldn't continue indefinitely. So the more the IRA drew them out with these increased actions, the more they seemed to be reacting with more severe reprisals. But the more that escalated, the more attention they were getting from global opinion. And I think that was one of the big factors in the truce and bringing the British to the table, was the negative attention they were getting internationally as a result of the reprisals. So without the flying columns, increasing their activities and their actions and their attacks, the reprisals wouldn't have been as severe, but that certainly couldn't go on forever. There certainly was the indication that, certainly, as Tim says, in Munster, the IRA were prepared and even in better condition than they'd ever been to sustain the nature of the war they were operating, but the response couldn't continue from the British in the way that they were operating.
Can I just jump in there and ask the question, who was this opinion coming from? The public opinion, where was it coming from?
What public opinion?
You said public opinion was against them in the press.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Yeah, no, of course. Well, I mean, there's international opinion in terms of Russia. There's international opinion around the world, but in terms of the most significant one for Britain was in America. And you have the case that a very organised and orchestrated campaign led by Harry Boland and I suppose Eamon de Valera being the centre of it, had, by the time you reached the flying column sort of levels of activity, had been in existence for a year and a half. So while there was significant opinion in America towards British rule, there had been, because of the coordinated nature of the awareness-raising aspect of de Valera's tour of America for a year and a half, had been huge attention and awareness. I mentioned in my letter, and the letter that was brought up, the levels of emotion as a result of the burning of Cork City. So, global attention is always significant. At that stage, you'd gone through First World War. Britain had been intensely aware of the nature of allies and the importance of it, economically as well as politically. So certainly the American negative attention coming from America was probably the most significant influencer on the way the British approached the Anglo-Irish truce.
I suppose the flying columns, they contributed to the making of Ireland ungovernable. And what use was the territory to England or anybody if the dog license couldn't be collected? You had the Republican course now held sway. I was just reading last night there about North Tipperary County Council. The councillors, they formed their own executive. They took their finances from away from the Munster and Leinster Bank. They deposited in under the authority of three trustees who happened to be priests, and they paid the council workers by their own cheque, and refused to pay out the huge compensation awards. So all this was happening. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just body counts. It was a number of things happening together. But the flying columns, they did contribute in a huge way to making Ireland ungovernable. The trenching of road, the cutting of communications, and just by their mere presence. So I could never take from any aspect or input into the War of Independence because the final result was eventually achieved. Britain were taken to the negotiating table. A small country to take the empire to that pitch. I think the flying columns, the age profile, young men, young motivated men, an amazing generation. We should never forget that. We shouldn't.
You all spoke about the impact of the War of Independence. You all spoke about the men being on the run and facing hardship and danger. And Pat Barry had a question: what was the impact of the War of Independence on the physical and emotional health of those on active service, and also the impact of active service on the volunteers' families?
I think that's a really important question that Pat has sent in. First, in terms of the men themselves, it's not, I don't think, a quantitative sort of answer, but in terms of the people I've spoken to over the years, I think there definitely was psychological impact. I'll give you one example. Joe Clancy, who I mentioned in my my lecturer, who was the training officer for the East Clare IRA and was involved in all of the major actions in terms of the major ambushes and involved in assassinations. I interviewed a man in about 2010, and I asked him about, in Killaloe, where Joe finished his life, and I asked him about Joe Clancy. And he recalled the funny stories of Joe claiming the IRA pension and the British Army pension, and Joe used to drink a good bit, and you know he was famously arrested during a De Valera speech in Killaloe and put into the 3-story RIC or Garda barracks, made his way up to the top floor, broke out the roof and started shouting down at the assembly below. So Joe was that character. But when I asked my interviewee in his 90s, did he remember Joe? And he said, I used to sleep beside him. And he went on to explain that Joe's house was next door. And not only that, his bed was next to the wall, and inside the wall was Joe's bed. And he said every night, or almost every night, at about 3 a.m, he'd be woken by the sound of a screaming man. And Joe used to wake 3 o'clock, scream and scream for about 10 minutes, fall back asleep. And the following day, he'd emerge to the public as the character, the funny man, the drinking man. So there's a definite, and that's regular right across many examples, certainly in Clare and in different parts of the country in my research, where an awful lot of men ended up drinking too much. And I suppose that's the only outward sort of illustration of emotional trauma for in that period, would be drinking too much. So I would think there's inevitable, when you're involved in the level of guerrilla warfare, is far more intimate than any other war. Of course, people in the First World War saw tremendous death and destruction, but the intimate nature of the guerrilla conflict had a massive impact. On the other side, just briefly to reflect on the impact on the families of those, and that's so critical, because when we get to a flying column stage, then the men are almost permanently on the run, or certainly are disconnected from their home. But their home isn't disconnected from the conflict, and you're seeing regular raids, over 48,000 in 1920 alone, on private houses. And these are private houses. In most cases, we don't know what went on inside the doors of those private houses when the raids took place. We know of the burnings, we know of the beatings. There's an awful lot we don't know about. But certainly the families and women in particularly endured an awful lot of pain and terror because of their connection and because of their solidarity to the men on the flying column. And those are many of those injuries, emotional as they were, never left those people. And some of them even, I found in the next generation of people, the level of anger they had when they spoke about all of that experience. There was almost a generational trauma, or intergenerational trauma as well.
See, we stand today and we speak from a position of hindsight. And we know that shots were fired at Solihull Beg on the 21st of January of 1919. We know that Sean Horgan was rescued in Knocklong on the 13th of, here in Knocklong on the 13th of May, 1919. We have the chronology at our fingertips. If we don't know something, we can Google it, you know. We can put sequence to it all. We can attach understanding at this stage. You know, if we care to study this. Just think of what was the War of Independence like for a person, say, back in, say, July 1920? What was it like for a participant? What was it like for, say, Dan Bryan, you know, wanted on capital murder charges? What was their mindset? So, we know that a truce was called on the 11th of July 1921. We know that because it's written in history books, and that's historical experience tells us that. It's a fact. On the 1st of July of 1921, how would Dan Bryan or any of those people, how would they have felt? Surely, with the mountain IRA losses, with tighter security, with all of these things, like, either live in denial or face the fact that capture at some stage was imminent. And where would all that end? For most of these fellas have ended at the end of a hangman's rope. So, how do you live your life with that shadow over you? Now, I wrote the book about Sean Horgan, and I was you know, the title of my book was Sean Horgan, and I searched for a subtitle, you know, and I tied around with a number of different connotations or different ideas, like, you know. And I finally decided on his life, a troubled journey. And when I wrote that book, I documented his life and, you know, his early life, his activities in the IRA and all of that. But what the book centres mostly on is the wider impact on Horgan himself, first of all, on his family, his acquaintances, and his life in general. And certainly it does not make for pretty reading. Now, Horgan's journey through life, I suppose, was pretty public. You know, he wasn't a man to as if it were to hide his misfortune, or perhaps not in a position to do that. But Horgan would not be an exception to that period. Many of those men, they drifted into alcoholism. You know, many got married late in life. Their marriage was dysfunctional. And again, like Tomas has said there, it really struck me when I interviewed Sean Horgan's son on several occasions I did, and even the effect that all that had on him. So this, to me, is another one of the great untold stories of the War of Independence, you know. And, you know, marriages, you know, love affairs that began in the midst of conflict. You know, when the guns fell silent, what was the position then? You know, women, you know, longing for security, you know, all the things that go with life and family, you know, now living with people who had such horrific experiences that they, you know, that just was not possible. And my final contention when to briefly sum up the life of Sean Horgan, I put it like this, that he was involved in the action at Salehe on the 21st of January of 1919. Two policemen fell dead. He went on the run. And my contention is, until he closed his eyes at Jervis Street Hospital on Christmas Eve in 1968, he stayed on the run. He never knew anything else. And from reading what records and interviews and people that I did with people, that became patently obvious to me. And as I spoke then to other people, he certainly wasn't the exception.
Yeah, just really to agree there with what the other speaker said. John Joe Rice, one of the Kerry No. 2 Brigade commander in the 1920s, at a commemoration to an unveiling of a monument to dead volunteers, said they were only remembering the people who had died. He said the number of those who had died of illness and those who had died in mental hospitals as a result of conflict could never be measured. So you had all that big aspect, and many of the monuments in County Kerry have names of men who weren't killed by the British, who weren't killed by the RIC, but who died as a result of active service rather than on active service. It also, kind of the enemy of republicanism certainly has always been respectability, and these men were regarded really as gunmen and terrorists at their time. It was only afterwards that they became respectable. Some of them a lot of them would have taken pensions from the 26th county government, but a lot of them didn't, and often those who held their principles most of the year refused to take any payment for it. And these were often men who themselves, or even their families, a pension would have been a great benefit to them. The other thing is that post-psychiatric or post-traumatic stress disorder was not really described until the 1970s when American veterans started coming back from Vietnam very disturbed. But in fact, this is something that follows every war, and a lot of these men who fought and did dreadful things and suffered dreadful things, these men suffered from this condition which was unrecognised, and they were ill understood. I know in one particular case in Clashmailkin Caves, where there was a dreadful incident, one of the men could never walk down the road to the left of his house for the rest of his life for over 50 years because of what happened there. So the reminders of mental trauma as well as physical trauma were everywhere, really, you know.
Thanks. And another question. Were the Irish flying columns the first example of this type of warfare in the world? And were they replicated in other countries?
I suppose they were replicated everywhere, really. We had them probably after the fall of Limerick, where you had the Rapparees and that who roamed the countryside. Probably to a certain extent, every army does have flying columns. In the American Civil War, they were there. But probably the most successful flying columns to be operated in modern times were probably those of the Boers as they fought the British Army. So highly mobile, small units could inflict damage and make countrysides uncomfortable.
One question from the floor here. 100 years still on, what about our 32 free islands? Do you think that's a long way out of what way to stand?
Just a handy question. So, look, I mean, I think the ambition must be still there. I think I've never heard a reasonable or effective argument for partition. We're 100 years on from the partitioning of the country, and is there anybody who can really make a reasoned and supported argument that that has worked? So I think surely the argument for the unification of the 32 counties is still an effective and logical position to take. Will it actually happen is another question entirely. I think that the experience in the north of Ireland over the last 50 years has created probably a mindset and an attitude and a feeling amongst the nationalists in the north of Ireland that has probably in some ways, if we're honest, separated them emotionally from us in any case. Of course there are people in the north and there are people in the south who still yearn for an independent or a 32 county republic, but I think we have to accept as a state the way that we behaved in the last 50 years, and if we're to judge ourselves by our media and our political establishment the way we continue to behave, I would question why any nationalist in the north of Ireland would want to be connected with this state. So I think it's not a simple question anymore of the reunification of the country. It's convincing not unionists, because I don't think they're convincible, but nationalists in the north of Ireland and the way that they feel abandoned by this state over the last 50 years, and the way, for example, we saw the revelations about the Glenanne gang last week or the week before last on the Unquiet Graves documentary, and there wasn't one discussion, not one discussion on any RTE radio or television station in the week that followed. When, if people like Jerry Adams or Martin McGuinness stepped on a bee, that should be the topic of discussion on Joe Duffy for the week afterwards. So I think there are massive questions to answer in regards to the state, to the Irish state, and our behaviour over the last 50 years that will affect the answer to your very important question.
Tomas, can I will say, go back on what you said, just listen to what you said there. Surely democracy in a democracy, okay, and we had agreed, we'll say, in relation to Northern Ireland, it's going to be the will of the people in time. And what did the state not do for the Republican element of Northern Ireland?
What did the state not do?
Yes, you said that, you would feel that the nationalists in Northern Ireland wouldn't be comfortable.
Well, I don't think they would, to be honest. I mean, the state didn't do anything, to support the nationalists in the north of Ireland. And you see, we can talk about democracy, but when things became really challenging in 69, 70, we had been 50 years independent as a state, and we secured that independence, as we discussed here today, through violence, and it was decided at that time, not by, an accepted democratic mandate, but by a decision that there was no other option to use violence to secure our independence and to secure then a political position to live within. But when 50 years later, nationalists in the north of Ireland faced, one could argue with utility, I think, even greater oppression, we decided that that was undemocratic and that was not supportable. So I think not only that, but compounding that for the following 50 years with, pushing a narrative that the IRA were the only evil people in the north of Ireland and everybody else seemed to be benign, I think has created a schism between this state and nationalists in the north of Ireland. Now, there's probably lots of people in the north who disagree with me, but I do think that is, one of the most challenging elements to, convincing nationalists in the north of Ireland that a 32-county Ireland is something worth actually pursuing.
Yeah, well, of course, the situation is extremely complex, and obviously, what was going to be done by peaceful means, which was the commitment at the time, and what would have meant bringing arms, to the north in the 70s, how would it have made this country look? Where would the future be, which will say UNIS, if that had happened? We all have to live in this island.
Of course, and I mean, that's a very reasonable point to make, but you'd also have to accept that in 1916 there were people making the same point about the Minmara after talking about here. There was a big conservative aspect of Ireland who were fundamentally opposed to what the flying columns were doing and would have made the similar argument about democracy and about, what that was saying about us as a people, that, what were being described as terrorists were roaming around the country murdering people, but now we're reflecting on it very differently today.
Okay, I would say if Tom Toomey was here, he would have cut me long ago there on that, because he just knows I'd love to get to this topic every time we get in. But such is the way. I think we have come to the end. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our 3 guest speakers today. They were fantastic and they gave great accounts. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank Tomas Welch and his team here. Did a fantastic job, and I hope the people listening in got the value of that. I'd like to thank our own team once more for everything they've done to make this happen. I think we have proven in this little village we can beat COVID in some way. So when things have been cancelled, we didn't cancel it. Mind you, I did hear from, during the evening, from Doon, and I think the flying columns might be gone, but certainly Liam Sullivan down in Doon could be in trouble, because his father, Tom Sullivan, said he missed the first 20 minutes due to bad IT work from his son. So we'll see what happens there. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you again. Hopefully next year we might be back to our tried and trusted system. I'm not sure, but again, I wish you a safe journey, safe home, and hope we can be back together again in 2021. Thank you very much.